Thank you all for coming along tonight. Talk about paddock trees. So this project is part of a project that's rolled out across 3 landcare groups. So Begoygi Creek, Springhurst, Bywater and Horseshoe Hodgson. So we've got a steering committee made up with representatives from all 3 landcare groups that are helping to get this project up and running. So the aim of our project is to raise awareness and implement some on-ground works to protect our waterways, reduce soil erosion and increase the health and number of paddock trees in our farming landscape. And the project is set up to do that in 2 ways. There's a series of information workshops which will be rolled out through September and October. And then into 2021 and 2022, there'll be a program of on-ground works where we have funding to assist landholders to actually do some works on their waterways and their scattered paddock trees. So that's a bit of background. Now, firstly, why, this is a bit of an outline of what we're going to cover tonight. So why are paddock trees important? Why are we losing them in our local landscape? What can we do as individuals to protect them? And at the end of my presentation, we're going to have a little case study with one of the landholders from the Greta Valley Landcare Group. Now, Brent, I'd like to welcome Brent Bailey here tonight. He's one of the farmers that I've worked with through 2 different programs of funding to protect paddock trees on their property. And we're going to have a bit of a discussion with Brent and show some maps and some photos about the types of works that we might be able to help with on your properties. So that'll be a little case study at the end, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that. So I just wanted to start off tonight with thinking about the definition of a paddock tree. So, because we just call them paddock trees, what are they? They are our old remnant trees, typically eucalypt species that are in our agricultural land. They often have very large spreading canopies. And that's usually as a result of them growing up with a lot of space around them so they can afford to grow up and out and maximise their light. So they can be individual trees or they can be in small clusters or patches. And often they're relics dating from pre-European settlement, so hundreds of years old, a lot of them. So when we think about that, they are possibly the oldest living thing at our landscape at the moment, which makes them pretty significant. So I wanted to pop this little slide up just to set the scene to start with. This is the view when you come down the hill on the Hume Freeway at Glenrowan and you look across on your right to Mount Buffalo. And this was a sketch done in 1862 of those plains. And you can sort of see in the foreground of that sketch here, these scattered trees which dot the edges of this hill and then stretch out across the plain. And this is what we would have called plains grassy woodland. So characterised by scattered trees, a very thin, sparse layer of shrubs and quite long, luxurious native grasses that sometimes were described as being up to waist height on saddles on horses. So the soils were quite rich down on the plains and it was quite open. So when we have our paddock trees left today, they're often relics from that pre-European landscape. So this is a photo of the same view today, taken in 2018, so 156 years later. And you can see in the foreground here, these are our paddock trees, which probably date back, you know, to at least 150 plus years old. And then you've got what else, where else we've got these blocks of vegetation. We've got like a woodlot planted over here. And in the middle of the screen is actually trees that were left along the banks of 15 Mile Creek. So why are paddock trees significant? And I think that that's answered pretty much in one word. It's their age that makes them significant. And that's because large old trees flower more profusely and for longer. And because they flower for longer and there's more flowers, they produce, as a rule, a lot more seed per tree. They contain a very diverse range of sizes of hollows, so everything from quite small to quite big hollows. And generally they have a lot more hollows on those trees because of their age. They also store the most carbon And that's because carbon content of a tree is about 50% of the overall tree biomass. So when you have a larger tree, you store more carbon. And so scattered paddock trees, because they're the oldest living features in the landscape, they provide pretty critical wildlife resources for a lot of our fauna. And they are preferred by many species, including some of our threatened species in the northeast, like superb parrots and squirrel gliders. So each of our large old trees in the paddock can tell a story, and they're often our favourite trees in the landscape. And I really like this photo of some landholders near Hansonville, and there's a daughter and a mum here just having a look at the tree, and their family's been farming in this area for 4 generations. So this one paddock tree has supported 4 different generations of farmers in the family over the past 160 years. So I think they're very significant, and we probably overlook that significance in our day-to-day management. So the 4 main reasons that paddock trees are important: for livestock production, for biodiversity, the amenity. So what I mean by amenity is they're the beautiful trees that we love to look at. You know, if we drive from where we live into Wangaratta, the landscape would look very different if we didn't pass the paddock trees on the way. And because of their age, they're very culturally significant, and a lot of them have probably got Indigenous stories associated with them as well. So we're just going to look at the 2 main values, which are livestock production and biodiversity. So from a production point of view, I think the most important function that they provide in a farming system is for providing shade and shelter. So during summer, providing protection on those really hot days from direct sunlight. And then over winter, they provide some shelter from cold winds, and certainly on cold frosty mornings, they provide a warm place to sit. So the trees actually absorb heat during the day through the trunk and in the canopy, so that biomass stores heat when the sun's out. And then overnight, that heat is slowly radiated back out around the tree. So that's why stock do get the benefit of keeping a little warmer overnight. So it's not just the direct protection from above from cold sinking air, but the tree itself actually helps to warm them. So the other benefits that they provide in a production system, they increase the abundance and the diversity of pollinating insects, which can then flow on to assist nearby crops and pastures and gardens. They also attract birds and bats and lizards to the paddock, and all of those animals help to act as natural pest control agents for other pests in your farming system, whether it's on your crops or in your pasture or in other parts of your garden or trees. They also help to improve soil structure by reducing wind and water erosion, and they also provide a steady stream of leaves and litter onto that surface of the soil, which in turn breaks down and helps to enrich the soil. They can help with managing saline areas by reducing waterlogging. And I've often heard Agriculture Victoria refer to them as water pumps. So trees are water pumps. They can absorb an enormous amount of water out of the system to help dry out, wetter areas. They can actually, on the other side of it, they can actually help to retain water in the landscape as well by increasing infiltration rates. So you'll get little holes and channels where the roots are around the tree, and water will follow those down and actually get better penetration of the soil with water than what you would otherwise have if it had been bare, compacted ground. So, and in that way, as the canopy of the tree shelters the ground from overhead sun, it can actually also reduce evaporation and keep that ground surface a little bit cooler. So when your soil temperature is a little bit less, so it's 40 degrees in a bare part of the paddock out in full sun versus 25 degrees under the tree, you've got quite a difference in evaporation rate as well. And so sometimes that can actually help to support pasture growth in those areas because the ground is just not getting as hot. From a biodiversity point of view, I think the key benefit that they provide is connectivity in the landscape. So they act basically like stepping stones and allow birds and mammals to move through the landscape. So I was having a look at pictures in your local area and I came across this this particular photo. So it's the Baralma-Tarrawingi Road shown in red, running north-south. And there's another road sort of east-west coming off that. And then there's an unused road reserve through the middle of the paddock that's got trees on. And then you've also got a shelter belt in the top left of the photo and a waterway corridor with some trees remaining here. And then this section of waterway is bare. And then over here, we've got a great cluster of paddock trees. So you can imagine that birds moving along these road reserves can nip out and take advantage of some of the resources provided here. And they may zigzag their way through here or choose to stop in a patch. Whereas in the paddock on the other side, where we don't have paddock trees, the movement of the birds is going to be more limited to along those main corridors. So some of the first research that was done back in 2002 by David Lindenmayer of the Australian National University, they were surprised with the results, because what they found is that birds regularly use paddock trees as a stopover before continuing on their way when they're moving through the landscape. And it was a lot higher in the number of species that do that than what they originally thought. And some of their studies actually led them to the conclusion that paddock trees provide a really important role in the overall ecosystem, and that given even the very small area occupied by the trees and the low biomass of the trees and how scattered they are, is probably disproportionate to what they provide in terms of value in the overall system. So what that means is that they really punch above their weight in biodiversity. So they're only small trees and they're scattered through the landscape, but collectively they play a very important role. So the other types of instances where paddock trees are important is if you've got a ridge line. So your birds tend to, when it's over winter, they'll sit up in the ridge, up in the bush, and be quite happy. And as those ridge lines get hotter and drier over summer, they'll want to move down the landscape towards the creeks with permanent water. And so paddock trees can help to form a bit of a path from the ridges to the creeks as well, to help in that sort of summer movement for fauna. And the other place is that when you've got paddock trees in close proximity to a road reserve, so say within 50 metres, they actually can provide sort of safe havens for small birds if they're getting harassed in those road reserves. So the little birds might try and escape from a predator, they'll nick across and they'll seek shelter in a paddock tree, and then later on move back out into that road reserve. So they're used by lots of animals in lots of different ways. So probably one of their other main functions, and again to do with their age, is that they provide essential habitat for hollow-dependent fauna. And basically that's because those hollows provide a site for them to breed safely. So we know hollows form where trees drop limbs and the wood breaks down over time, and that can be helped, that sort of process can be helped along by wind and rain and rot and insects and termites. And look, generally they say that it takes 80 to 100 years for small hollows to form. And we do know that some species form hollows more readily than others. And certainly my experience is that river red gum form them the quickest of all of our trees in our local landscape. And something like red box, due to the density of the timber, and they drop less limbs, I think, overall. They often have a lot less hollows on them for trees of a similar age. So hollows are really significant, and there are 58 of our species in the Northeast Victoria area that are absolutely dependent on hollows for survival. So of those 58 species, 11 of those are threatened species in our local landscape. So hollows are really critical to the survival of those species. And of those 58, there's 26 mammals. So the mammals would be things like brush-tailed phascogales and bats and other possums and gliders. And there are 32 species of birds. So the type of birds that use hollows typically are owls and parrots, rosellas, and some of the other smaller birds like tree creepers as well. So here's some pictures of what we were just talking about. So brush-tailed phascogales down in the bottom left, they're listed as vulnerable, and we do have them in our local landscape. There's certainly, we have some near Glenrowan, and I know they're up in the Chiltern Mount Pilot National Park, and I'd be very surprised if they're not through areas around Begoyki as well. You've got squirrel gliders, which are often seen as well as sugar gliders in hollows and in nest boxes right across our local landscape. And then you've got in the top right, these are turquoise parrots, which nest in hollows, typically quite low to the ground hollows, vertical hollows, up around the Chesney Vale Hills and the Warby Ranges. And then you've got your brown tree creeper in the bottom right, which is sort of scavenges and uses hollows and cracks and crevices for feeding as well. So one of the other services that these trees provide is food and habitat for foraging. So that can be the cracks and crevices under the bark, on the fallen limbs from the tree that are on the ground. The paddock trees provide a lot of food for insectivorous eating birds and bats and lizards. So the tree attracts a lot of insects, and then those insects in turn attract the birds, the bats and the lizards. They also directly provide a lot of nectar for our nectar feeding birds and our mammals that appreciate nectar like squirrel gliders. And the pollen itself from the flowers that help our native pollinating insects. And that's also not forgetting that European honeybees produce some of our favourite types of honey from eucalypts, and that our oldest trees provide our largest sources of nectar. So from a honey production point of view, they're also pretty important. So different species of eucalypts flower at different times of the year. And so having a diversity of species on your property means that you're providing food for insects and birds across all times of the year. So it's really good to not put all your eggs in one basket and have a bit of a mix of things on your property where you can. Now, something that often gets overlooked is that paddock trees provide a really important source of seed for natural regeneration. So windblown seed provides the easiest and the most robust method of revegetation in our paddocks. And if we lose all our paddock trees, then that source of future seed is also lost. So why are we losing paddock trees in our landscape? And look, it's really, I think that most of our trees aren't suffering from just one single stress. It's often multiple things together that increases the load on a tree, which can eventually cause the death of the tree. And when I started to have a look up for the definition of what dieback was, it's probably a pretty loosely used term that can describe a whole lot of different impacts on the tree. But really, I think it came down to it's sort of that protracted decline in the health and the vigour of the trees over time, or the premature death of the tree. And I think that we are seeing this happen across our landscape. Certainly not a new phenomenon. I've got a great book written on dieback that was printed back in 1986. So here we are 35 years later, and we're still learning and still seeing the same sorts of symptoms. So I'm just going to give you some local photos for different reasons for tree decline in our area as I've experienced it. And I'll try and provide some context around each one. So reasons for decline in our area: natural attrition. So all trees have a lifespan, and some I think are just naturally coming to the end of their life because they're hundreds of years old. Some trees, their natural life might have been taken a bit quickly. This particular tree was hit by lightning, which we would consider to be a natural event, but certainly it knocked out this yellow box tree at Moyu, and it was an otherwise healthy tree prior to that storm. A big reason for the decline in numbers has been climate change, and that's because of longer dry spells and a change in flooding regimes for some of our areas down on the flats. So a lot of our trees in the Greta Valley catchment were lost during the Millennium Drought, including trees like this red box at Greta South. So prolonged dry periods during drought, when coupled with other stresses that the tree might also be experiencing, like stock access, can be enough to cause the death of trees. And so some of these species might also be on the edges of their climate ranges. And so as we get these changes in climates, the ranges where some of these species used to once be happy might be shifting. So we're seeing that in the Greta Valley catchment, where red stringy bark trees used to be down quite a lot around Greta West, and now they're progressively dying off and moving further up the catchment towards Greta South and into the more higher rainfall and elevation areas in our catchment. So land use pressure, I guess that takes the form, or two main forms. So one of them is through livestock and one would be through cropping. So from a livestock point of view, the biggest impacts would be compaction of the soil around the base of the tree and direct browsing of the foliage and the bark by the cattle. When they're used as stock camps, that can mean a lot of excessive nutrients are left at the base of the tree. And having stock there all the time can also suppress the emergence of the next generation of paddock trees, because the stock will happily come and munch any new trees that regenerate through there, which means that there's no replacements to take the place of older trees over time. So we're losing our ability to replace these trees in the landscape. So in a cropping application, the main impacts have probably been the physical removal of these trees to help in the farming enterprise. So where you've got big centre pivots set up, they've often had to remove the trees to get that irrigation infrastructure in place. And then I guess you also have other indirect impacts like spray drift from herbicides and also excessive fertiliser application, which the trees really don't like. So that's probably a bit of a broad overall summary of land use pressures. Now, insect attack's a really interesting one. Eucalypt leaves are pretty well adapted to insect attack, as the leaves contain oils and compounds which are actually there to deter insects from eating them. However, it's these excessive fertilisers from the manures at the base of the trees and there's other environmental stresses that can cause the trees to put out these real flushes of very thick epicormic growth. So they're little buds that live under the bark of the tree that burst out when the tree's under stress. And so with these, this new growth, it's really soft and fleshy. It's quite nutritious and generally it's got less toxicity, it's of a less toxic nature. And so it is really palatable to the insects. And so the more that the insects eat the leaves on the tree, the more stressed the tree becomes, the more new leaves it puts out, which are even softer and less, the toxic level in them is even less. So it just creates this constant cycle of defoliation on your trees. And it's that constant cycle which eventually causes the death of the tree, because the tree just can't keep producing an unlimited amount of new foliage. And the stored carbohydrate reserves in the root systems in the tree are eventually depleted and it just can't keep going on. So you can see evidence of it in this photo here. This was taken on a red box tree at Greta. And so you've got that sort of typical dieback right through the ends of these limbs, the browning off of foliage. And so it's this repeated sort of defoliation of the tree, I guess, that over time is just going to make that really hard to survive. So the next one's a more contentious issue, mistletoe. So mistletoe is a bit of a friend or a foe thing. There's a lot we need to learn about mistletoe and that will help us to manage it appropriately in our landscape. And I know that our paddock trees really suffer from the impacts of mistletoe, and Brent will probably talk about that a little bit later. So it's often seen as the cause of the death of the tree, but in most cases I think it's probably an additional load on the tree, and there's been other things at play as well. So in most cases I don't think it's the only cause of death of the tree. Some facts and figures for you. There are 97 species of mistletoe that are native to Australia, and there's 1,200 across the world. So it is quite a common plant. About half of those in Australia are found in the southern regions of Victoria and New South Wales. So we have about 47 down here. So although it is a parasite, Mistletoe produce their own food by photosynthesis, and they obtain just the water and the minerals from the host plant. So the times when your mistletoe is probably going to have the most impact on your tree is during a drought, because water supply to that tree is limited, and they can draw a considerable amount of water from the branch into their own tissues. So David Watson, who's the head Australian mistletoe researcher that we're very lucky to have, has done a great deal of work on these plants. And he said that while they can be called a parasite, really they can't really be called a killer. And that's because the well-being of the host plant is in direct interest to the mistletoe. Starving the host plant compromises their own survival. So it's really not in their interest to draw that much energy out of the plant if they cause death of the tree. However, I think it's when you have multiple infections, like what you're starting to see on the tree in this photo here, and that it shortens the tree's life by making it more susceptible to other stresses like drought, an insect attack, or a fungal infection or something like that. So there are two primary birds that spread mistletoe. There's the small mistletoe bird, which tends to work in small localised ranges, and there's the painted honeyeater, which flies longer distances to carry seed. So the mistletoe bird is typically more of a fringe dweller, and so that sort of explains why you often see the worst or the thickest areas of mistletoe around the edges of your forest, but not inside the forest, because that bird tends to work around, you know, the fringe. So on a roadside reserve, they'll move up and down that, and they will hop across to individual paddock trees and continue to spread through there. So we do see our worst or densest areas of mistletoe on roadsides, around the edges of remnant patches, and in our single paddock trees. So in a balanced ecosystem, mistletoe is actually really valuable because the leaves of mistletoe are very nutrient rich. The flowers are much more rich, and the leaves have a water content which is something like 4 times the water content of eucalypt leaves. So they're really quite soft and fleshy, which makes them really attractive for mammals and insects to forage in and eat. So the dense mistletoe clumps, because of that water content, can provide really cool respite during heat waves for birds and for mammals. And they do provide preferential nesting sites for many birds. So there's been a lot of research done on mistletoe, and in a woodland system, which is like most of our areas of remnant bush that we have around us, if you have mistletoe in it compared to a similar system that doesn't, the research results suggest that you'll have 40% more birds in those systems with the mistletoe. And that's primarily because the leaves on those trees drop to the ground. They're very nutrient rich. The insect activity at ground level goes up underneath those trees. And with an increase in insects, you have an increase in lizards. You also have an increase in birds. So the whole food chain is sort of bumped up a level by the presence of that mistletoe. So that's all good in a natural system. And in a natural system, there are animals that help to keep this under check and under control. And one of the biggest predators for mistletoe are brush-tailed possums, who can eat a huge amount of these leaves in a night and tend to kind of keep it in balance. However, in a paddock tree system, you know, a single tree out in the middle of a paddock, you're not likely to have a brush-tailed possum run across 200 metres of open farmland to go and get to one tree. So, you know, we've got, what's working against us there is that we have birds that like to spread it to isolated areas like paddock trees, and we have no natural predator that can get out to those trees to actually control the mistletoe on them. So I did ask David Watson, the key mistletoe researcher, you know, when should we start to get worried about mistletoe on our paddock trees? And his answer was that when mistletoe dominates more than 50% of your canopy, then I think you need to do something about it. And so the typical ways that we can manage mistletoe, we can use an arborist to remove that from the tree. And I guess you can do that. And we've seen them use like a scissor lift or something like that to hop up safely and do it, or they'll climb using harnesses and ropes and lop off the affected branches. You can also, at ground level, you can use like a pole saw, a hand pole saw, or a chainsaw on a pole to trim low-level infections. And I did trim a section of this tree using a 4-metre long extendable pole saw, which was pretty effective, but we couldn't reach anything higher. So I've also heard of people using their shotgun to sort of blow off the end of the branch and shoot the mistletoe off, and targeted spraying of herbicides to control infestations, which will work without killing the tree if you're very careful. And there is literature that suggests that doing controlled burns underneath the tree will kill the mistletoe, and then the tree will regenerate later. But I think it does depend on how much heat is generated by that burn and the general health of the tree as to whether that is a suitable option for some of our paddock trees. So does anyone have any questions at the moment about mistletoe? Before, we might pause here for a minute, and I'm really happy to field any questions if you have them. I think everyone's got their, oh yep, so everyone's on mute, but we can unmute you. Landy can make that happen, and you can unmute yourselves if you have a question. Otherwise, we'll continue along. Everyone's happy? No? Craig's got a question. All right, Craig.
How long ago, I recall as a young fella, used to be crews going along the Ovens Highway, cutting the mistletoe out of the trees. Obviously, it was some sort of a council or government program, and I'm talking about in the 50s, maybe the 60s. So it must have been seen at some stage as a significant threat to great.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, we know that it is a threat, and look, there's areas where and trees, and Brent can talk about this too when we get to Brent, but the trees do respond really well if it's removed and if we can manage to keep it off the trees. The Region Honeyeater project over near the Lurk Hills has spent a lot of money on arborists removing mistletoe from paddock trees, and it's been very successful. So there's a lot of research on it. There's certain trees that seem to be more susceptible to it than others, and particular species. So some of the research suggests that the birds, if they're feeding in, say, an ironbark tree, they move, it's like they've got blinkers on when they go and fly to the next tree. So they've eaten seed, that they'll look for the next ironbark tree, and that's where they go, and that's where they do their little poop and poop their seed out onto the branch, and that's how the new mistletoe grows. So it's sort of like they don't see other trees, and they move from species to species when they're feeding of the same, you know, this very similar plant. So I think it is, and certainly if you drive up to Hume, you can see it near the Chiltern Mount Pilot National Park. The ironbark is covered in it up there. So a little bit of it is good. In road reserves and in paddock trees is probably where we see it at its densest, and it's not necessarily being controlled in the same way that it would have in a large patch. And I think that's where it gets out of control, and probably why there's been programs to manage it before. So I hope that answers your question. Anyone else with a question? All right, we'll continue on. So we'll go back to some of the other reasons for decline. Storm damage, that's something that's happened a lot over the last couple of summers over near Greta and Moyeu. So really large summer windstorms has led to the loss of limbs and the uprooting of many complete trees. So I guess in a natural woodland, when trees are surrounded by other trees, they've got a bit of a buffer to those extreme winds. And isolated paddock trees just don't have that buffer. So they really are going to cop the full brunt of whatever storm is coming through. So one landholder I know lost 42 of his mature paddock trees in one single storm event on his property at Moyeu. And that's an irreplaceable loss of shade for his property. And it will also have really big implications for biodiversity as well. So with climate change, they're forecasting, you know, more summer storms. Then I think that storm damage becomes quite a real threat for some of our paddock trees. So one of the other reasons, and certainly this one, you know, would have just recently happened through the Upper Murray area and parts of South Coast New South Wales in the fires that have just been experienced this summer. You know, impacts by fire are pretty significant for these trees because they're often hollow and quite old. When fire gets up in them, it can burn right up through the middle. And it's not just bushfires, I guess, that we need to be worried about. It's also prescribed burns, burning of paddock stubble, burns to clean up paddocks that might get a bit out of control. There's a number of different fire threats to these trees. So there was a study done in the Riverina area of New South Wales called the Southwest Slopes between 2005 and 2011. And they actually assessed with the fires that had burnt through that area that they'd lost 20% of their paddock trees to the impacts of the fire. So it is quite a real threat and can be quite significant. And there's organisations like Blaze Aid who do a lot to replace fencing for farmers in those burnt out areas, have actually been replanting single paddock trees as well for a lot of those properties. I saw it on a Facebook post lately. So that is definitely a very real threat. Dryland salinity can have detrimental impacts on paddock tree health as well. And that lower photo on your screen is actually taken in the Biodiversity Hills area back in the early 2000s. There was a big study done in 2001, which we'll talk about in a minute, of paddock trees and their health, which came out through the Heartlands project, which was something that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority sponsored to do with salinity at the time. So at what rate are we losing paddock trees? Well, most of the literature suggests it's somewhere between 2 and 11% per year, which is pretty scary. If it's 1 in 10 of your trees you're losing every year, then that in 10 years, that means you're not going to have much left. So I think that's probably at the upper end of things. Certainly the best data that we have locally was a study completed in the Biodiversity Hills area in 2001, which provides some local results. And what they did was choose 2 properties in that area, and they used aerial photography to count the number of isolated paddock trees and look at the health of those trees. And they looked at them in 1972 based on photos, and then they looked at the same trees in 2001, and they basically matched up to have a look at the differences between them. So the results of the aerial photo assessment were ground truthed as well, and they found that there was pretty good consistency between what looked healthy on the aerial photo and what was healthy on the ground. So this is the results of that study. So you can see 1972 on the left of your screen, all of the green dots represent trees. And then 2001 on the right of your screen shows the trees that were present then 29 years later. Now, it is important to note that there was no deliberate clearing of trees that happened on these properties during that time. So over 29 years, they lost nearly half of the paddock trees on that particular property. And it was a very similar figure for the other property that they looked at as well. Then what they did was actually on the ground and using the photos, have a bit of a look and say, okay, how are the health of those trees that are left in 2001? So the ones that they thought were in reasonable health are shown with a green dot, and the ones that they thought were declining and were in poor health, they gave and assessed a red dot. And so what you get is a bit of a picture of what looks good and what doesn't look good. And across these 2 different properties, you can see the 2 different shapes there. They basically estimated that 1 in every 3 trees was in a state of decline. Now, the vegetation type that they were talking about here was red stringy bark and red box. And they were remnants that these are both in sort of a granitic hills woodland vegetation type. And they presented that 30% of those trees were probably going to be dead within the next 10 years. So by 2011, that was the conclusion from the study, that they predicted that they would die by then. So did they die? I'm not sure, and I'd really love to repeat this study because I think it'd be interesting to know if that forecast came true. So my gut feeling is that some of our trees probably hold on in pretty poor shape for longer than what we think in our catchment. However, certainly we know that the natural range of red stringy bark is changing, and maybe that's what we've seen. Maybe a lot of these red dots were red stringy bark, and maybe that's what's been changing in this catchment, and that it's restricting, you know, its natural happy range of where it likes to grow is changing over time. So I guess it's worth us thinking about how losing those trees is going to impact on your property and for you. And look, many of the trees are simply very old, and there are no replacement trees coming through in our paddocks to take their place. And so that cumulative effect is that we're slowly losing paddock trees from our landscape. And as we lose more trees, this further increases the stresses and the pressure on the remaining trees that are left, because instead of having 2 trees in a paddock for stock to stand under, suddenly you only have 1. That tree is going to find it a lot harder. So, you know, when you start to lose them, obviously the main thing is that there's going to be a direct loss of shade and shelter on your property, and that can result in lower weight gain for your stock and lower production overall. So, because animals are therefore going to have to expend some energy in either keeping warm or keeping cool that they would otherwise put into production of meat or wool, as it may be. So, a bit of a productivity impact there. Overall, in our landscape, we'll have a reduction in tree cover, and therefore we'll have a change in food sources for our birds and mammals. So that might affect how they move through the landscape or what they have access to at different times of the year seasonally. So that impact on connectivity, in my mind, is going to mean that our landscape is going to be less resilient, because we've made it harder for them to get the necessary food and shelter and breeding that they need to survive. So that's going to have some implications for some of our species. And if we continue to lose our very large trees that have a lot of hollows, that will have direct implications for those 58 species that rely on hollows for survival. So I guess moving forward, what can we do? How can we help? And I think the really important thing that we need to do is to maintain a balance between managing the mortality of the remaining larger trees we have in paddocks, and also encouraging new trees to come through or planting new trees to come through to take their place. So we have to strike a bit of a balance there. So I think the first step is that large old trees are irreplaceable. We can't, if hollows take 100 years to form, you know, and we know that some of these trees are a couple of 100 years old, that have got a big, great, diverse range of hollows on them. We can't afford to lose these trees unnecessarily. We need to do what we can to protect them. So I think a big part of that is trying to convince our communities that, you know, there is a huge value of paddock trees to farms and a really significant importance to our local biodiversity to retain them. So how can we protect our old trees? So I think the first thing is to identify the main threats to trees on your property and manage for them. So if you go out and it looks like the stock are rubbing on the bark and breaking the roots and eating leaves and low branches, then the first thing is probably to consider, is there a way that I can fence this out? So working out what the threat is and managing for that threat, that's your first port of call. The second one could be to reduce your stocking rates or rotationally graze, so that, you know, maybe you're only going to have stock in that paddock for 2 days out of every 40 in a month or something like that. So therefore, although there might be some impacts on those 2 days when the stock are in that paddock, it's short-lived, and that tree gets, you know, a reasonable amount of time to rest when the stock are removed. So my third suggestion here is to develop farm plans and assess your shade needs. So always looking for what's going to happen if I lose those trees, and do I have some replacements, or can stock go and shelter under a nearby shelter belt, or, you know, some other protected area. So looking at shade right across your property in every paddock and seeing what you need, I think, is important, and starting to factor that into your annual planning to keep building that. So my fourth point here is to incorporate your paddock trees into protected areas where you can. So that might take the form of a separate fenced area around a tree, but that is quite hard to do, and we're going to talk about that in our case study coming up next. So the other ways that we can help to manage those trees are by including them into fenced areas on our farm, like waterways and shelter belts. So in that way, you start to achieve multiple objectives. You've fenced out a waterway, you've protected water quality, you've reduced erosion on your creek, you've also protected some of your large trees. And in the same way, in a shelter belt, if you can include your large trees into a shelter belt, you actually immediately have a shelter belt with very good habitat value because you've included a large tree. So the second way to manage our paddock shade moving forward is to encourage natural regeneration. So that can be done by excluding stock from areas around your paddock trees and letting your recruits come up like in this photo. You'll find that the most of your seed is often deposited on the downwind side of the trees. So if you're going to fence the side out, it's worth thinking about which side of the tree you put your fence on, because you are likely to get them pop up, more dominantly on one side than the other. You can help with the germination of those seeds by scarifying the surface of the soil in your paddock. So just, running a rake through it, or, lightly disking the top just to break the seed coat on those seeds and start the germination process. You can also scalp the top sort of 5 centimetres of soil off through the paddock, which does a couple of things. It helps to scarify the surface. It also helps to reduce that really thick layer of broken down manure that sits on the surface, which trees aren't used to, like our native trees certainly aren't used to. And that soil's probably better on your veggie patch than around the base of your large trees. So little cool burns around the base can also help to open up the ground, reduce competition with grasses, create a bit of bare patches so that the light and the moisture can get to that seed, and we can help those trees to germinate. So that's a few suggestions there. And the third way is to plant replacement trees. Now, if you do go and plant replacement trees, you have a lot of scope to do it wherever you like on your property. So if you want to create shade in areas where you currently don't have it, this is your main way to go about it. You can also introduce different types of species, and you can also target specific areas. So if you don't have shade near troughs, you can go and put some paddock trees over there with the aim of having good shade, in 5 or 10 years' time. So I think the 2 ways we can encourage more trees on our property, spelling paddocks on a regular basis by setting aside paddocks for longer periods and giving them a good rest. So we know at the end of the millennium drought, when a lot of farms had destocked, there was a lot of regeneration which came up naturally over that period, which we're seeing now, is sort of 10 years old and really getting going. So resting your paddocks also gives time for your old trees to recover, and it also encourages recruitment of new trees. Increasing the overall number of trees in your paddock helps to spread the load. So the more trees you have for stock to shelter under, the less impact on any one individual tree. And I think that, planting trees is a long-term investment. It's going to be at least 5 years before you get any usable shade from anything you plant, and potentially it's more like 7 to 10. So we really do need to start soon and think about how to do that, which brings us to the topic of our next workshop, which will be on the 27th of September, which I'll keep you all alerted to by email. So fencing isolated trees, like I mentioned, the best solution is to include them into a shelter belt or a waterway corridor or a remnant patch, because it gives you a really good head start on habitat development in those areas. Paddock trees are really difficult and expensive to fence as freestanding sites, and that's because of the number of corner posts that's needed. You have to have a gate. You're trying to strain very short sections of fence, which is nearly impossible. So when you're doing your freestanding paddock tree sites, then really they're best suited to electric fencing. But then there's problems with that because you've actually got to get power out to that area where your site is, or otherwise you've got to have like a solar unit there. It is good to include shrubs in those areas, and that's to provide habitat for birds, because what we want to do is attract birds and a greater diversity of birds back to these sites, and to have them there year round to predate the insects on your tree and actually to use that tree more, I guess, all year round. So if we can include a range of different shrubs, and prickly shrubs like sweet Becerria are really good, and I usually put in a range of different wattle species, and even things like hopbush and Cassinia are really great for diversity. So try and get a mix of flowering times in there and a mix of different heights of shrubs, and that's going to provide your maximum benefit for your birds. So adding fallen timber to the sites is really good where you can. So potentially moving timber that might be on their own out in the paddock and placing it inside the fenced area before you do your fencing is good. And as I mentioned before, consider scalping to remove that top 5 centimetres of soil from your site before you fence it. So that sort of brings me to the end of my formal presentation, and now we've got this little case study with Brent. I'm really happy to open up to questions again. If anyone has any questions about some of those concepts that we've just talked about. So we've talked about the threats, the remaining threats to those paddock trees, and also the type of things that we can do to help mitigate those threats or manage those threats, I guess.
Sally, I might jump in while others are thinking. And firstly, apologise for my late arrival. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thanks, Yolandi, for giving me a nudge. With the natural regeneration, one thing that can happen is that you get a thicket of trees, and we've got several places where that's occurred, and you know, they might be 20 years old now, but they're all, you know, like bean poles and all overcrowded. And I think that you know, we need to do something about that, and maybe reduce the numbers and give a couple a chance to become bigger trees. But I haven't heard much talk about how you go about that, or you know, what's the ideal space that a tree will need to enable it to grow to its potential. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yep, that's a great question. Look, river red gum are really great at doing that, because you'll get they tend to germinate based on a flood event or a rainfall event or some sort of submersion over a period, and you'll get a whole lot of recruits of the same size sort of pop up quite thickly. So there's a few things to consider. So purely talking from a woodland point of view, the basic number of stems per hectare in a woodland is 50. So a hectare is 100 by 100 in terms of metres, if we want to think about it in a perfect square. And so in a natural woodland, you would only have 50 trees in that 100 metre by 100 metre area. So most of what we see today, even our roadside reserves, is a lot denser and thicker than what we would have had naturally in areas of our landscape. So I've had a talk about this with multiple other people, and often it's nearly marking out removing 9 out of 10 trees in your little regen area, and removing and just keeping 1 out of every 10. It's quite a scary density when you start to think about it. If you get to your trees when they're only, you know, 30 centimetres tall, it's probably less worrying, because you can walk around with a pair of secateurs and a little bottle of Roundup, and you can thin them out quite easily. When you're coming to a patch that's 10 or 20 years old and you're wanting to thin it, it becomes a little bit harder because it's quite a bit more work, for one. And I have seen it done at various stages. And I guess the earlier that you get to those areas of regen, the better. If you're going to remove them after 10 years, I think you actually have to have a planning permit from your local council. So at the moment, you can thin areas of thick regrowth without a planning permit approval, and I will need to check this, but I'm pretty sure within 10 years of that event having occurred and that regen coming up. So the earlier you get to them, the better form you get as well. If those trees are already 10 years old and you remove everything around them, they're very unlikely to have the beautiful lateral branches and the really full canopy that we want out of those trees. So the other way that you can do it is to pop a guard, selectively pop tree guards around the ones that you do want to protect, and then let cattle come in and eat out all the others that you don't. So there's a few different ways that you can do it. You can also, if they're an older diameter, you know, older size tree of a reasonable diameter, you know, you can harvest, you know, this sort of size stuff for firewood and basically thin your plantation in that way. So it is the reason why our natural paddock trees, most of them have beautiful big arching full forms, and that's because they've had a good amount of light during their growth, and so they've got that nice shaped canopy. When they're all squashed in, they compete for moisture at a great rate. So everyone's growth is slowed by the fact that there might be, you know, 20 stems in a square metre. So if you get to them early, you'll get much better growth rate and a much better growth form, I think, than leaving it later. I hope that helps. It's a really complex topic. Cecily, we could probably talk for half an hour just around thinning, I think. It's quite a, you know, there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, but no, that's there's some good points in that, Sally, and a few pointers to where we might go. So thanks for that.
So we might move on to our case study, and I'd like to welcome Brent Bailey here. Brent, do you want to unmute yourself so you can have a chat to us? So Brent lives over on Steeps Lane, which is over in Glenrowan West. And I've popped up a map of his property on the screen here. Now, we've looked at a number of different trees on Brent and Pauline's place over 2 rounds of project funding where we had money to protect scattered paddock trees. So you can see all those little yellow dots there. They're all the trees that I've assessed at Brent's place. And nearly all of them we've actually done some work on at one point or another, except for the little cluster of red gums in that top right corner. I think they're the only ones we never ended up fencing. But so welcome, Brent, and thanks for coming along. I guess what I wanted to get a sense of from you is to have you talk to everybody about what's been happening to the paddock trees on your property over the time that you've been there, and to share that with us if you can, please.
Greetings, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Thanks. Look, we have very specifically got involved in land care for the purpose of funding off, for getting funding on some of these isolated trees. Now, you may just see our house, the big bit of white down in the bottom corner, and then a tree directly in front of it. And we were told about 30 years ago that tree was on the point of dying. And we had these tree climbing arborists come in with their little chainsaws. We spent $1,700 on about 5 significant trees on the property. In a day, these 3 guys significantly reduced the amount of mistletoe. Now, I know mistletoe is important to have for the Regent honeyeater and a lot of other wildlife, but at that stage, it was really taking our trees out. So we have done some individual funding. Now, this particular group of trees you see at the moment, I think some stringy barks. I'm not really good on my tree varieties, but stringy barks in this area have been fenced off. We fenced off 2 of the 3 because it was going to be excessive fencing with fencing off the 3, but we'll also be interested to see how the 2 fenced off survived compared to the one that wasn't fenced off. You can see mistletoe in this tree too, and it probably needs the arborist back again. Those guys were really slick to watch, and we felt it was good value at the time. Okay, so fencing. The fencing we've done recently under grants from Landcare, they were ring lock on treated pine corner posts with a couple of hot wires. We don't put the solar unit up there unless we've got stock in the paddock, and we don't even bother with insulators on the treated pine post because we can get away with a small solar unit there for those two top wires. At the moment, you can see they're not tensioned up properly, but that has worked. My sheep didn't like it when I powered that wire up on one of the paddocks. The other thing is I don't go to the expense of the strainer posts, particularly if I can come up with a hexagonal arrangement of protecting trees, because the forces aren't quite so significant in a hexagonal arrangement. So this is a hexagonal fencing off that we've done. And that's my little electric vehicle, or my wife's little electric vehicle that you can see there on the side as well. A lot of little understory planted, as Sally has mentioned, the different species, but they are really struggling. We're not getting a very fast growth rate out of them. And next time I wonder whether I wouldn't go ahead and use rabbit-proof fencing and perhaps be able to avoid the individual rabbit-proof guards, because even when the plants get above the guards, they still seem to get nipped by something. Perhaps it's a cockatoo, don't know. That's a little bit of it. We are really keen to try and protect these trees, and it really improved the appearance of the place. So this is one of our most recent plantations, and fairly happy with the way that is coming along at the moment. We had about a 10% loss of trees from last year, and they've all been replaced. And I think we've lost one or two, but not very significant this year, the losses. That's some of it, Sally.
And so when it comes to re-veg, I guess Brent mentioned that we've had troubles with impacts of you know, rabbits. We've had impacts with kangaroos at a lot of our sites. And look, we have learned some really valuable lessons about doing the re-veg. So this is one of the earlier sites that Brent and Pauline had done, and we fenced too close to the drip line of the trees, which just made it impossible for shrubs to grow underneath. And for a number of reasons. I think the primary reason is, well, water is just, you know, it's all used up by the tree, and there's nothing left for those shrubs. And also from a light point of view, shrubs really need light, good strong light. And so when they're underneath, they really struggle to get going. And also a lot of the eucalypts, you know, they produce that phototoxin in their leaves, which actually stops other plants from growing underneath their canopies anyway. So we learnt between the first round of our project and the second round that we needed to make our sites bigger. And if we wanted to get the shrubs established, then we had to plant them outside of the drip lines and in a block on one side. So I don't think that's necessary at all sites, and it depends on what your objective is. If your stock are really harming the bark on the tree and the lower branches, then putting up a fence like this immediately stops, you know, stock impacts on the tree and pretty much under the drip line. So they can't impact the roots, they can't rub. So you are having a positive impact straight away. Stock can still move around and make use of the shade. So you can see the shade over the back behind the buggy. They're still going to be able to use that shade and move around the tree at various times of the day. So it depends on what your objective is and what you're trying to achieve. For us in these projects, we were really trying to get the shrubs established at them. And so most of our learning and experimenting is around that. But I do think that just fencing out the tree itself has definitely got a place. Now, I've got a couple of other photos, Brent. This was your red box tree down the back, and it was a beauty. I've moved in a lot of fallen timber from elsewhere in the paddock into this one. And it was another hexagonal one, so you can sort of see that shape around there, and it was a bit bigger, and I think that this has probably been a bit more of a successful site. Would you say so?
Yes, it's just the cost of losing grazing area that influences you in that regard, that's all. Sally, I'd like to just do an experiment. We have got 2 old photographs of our property, and I have never tried it, but see if the camera can bring that up for me. If you just hold on for a moment, and I'll just pick those off the wall and see how we go.
Yep. So I think in terms of the shrubs here that we planted, Brent.
Going back quite a while, no, it's not going to come up very well.
Are there more trees on there, Brent? Is that what you're trying
it's
to
not going to be good enough.
What did you want to demonstrate, Brent? That there were more?
They're just 2 photographs of our property over the 30-year period, which show our significant increase in tree plantation along the waterways particularly.
Yep.
And like a lot of other people, we've got a bit of assistance to fence off waterways. And we also got assistance with putting in water pipes so that we could have stock water to the paddocks, and the stock didn't have to go to the dams and the creek for water.
Yep.
And that's been a dramatic improvement. I mean, if you drive around some areas of our, not our district, but neighbouring districts, and you see the creek areas just still have not been fenced off, and there's still the erosion on the banks. It's very disappointing to see when there's funding available, or has been funding available, to make things a lot better.
And you can see on this is showing Brent's property here. I've got the fencing plan back up. This, you know, that's that waterway that runs right through the middle there. And so because this runs north-south, you get some really fantastic late afternoon shade on the back side of all of these corridors and belts, and little pockets of areas in through here that provide really great shelter in the hot afternoon. So that's something that we'll be talking about. We do have workshops planned to talk about best practice on waterway management. So there's some of the things that we'll start to look at with that. Now, does anyone have any questions for Brent while I have him here, just around the protection of paddock trees? Just check that no one's waving at me. Well, thank you, Brent. I'll keep skipping through our slides. You've done a lot of great work at your place over the last couple of years, and I thank you and Pauline. I'm just quickly on conclusion, just going to show you a few photos of other sites that we fenced under those programs and some of the learnings that we had from them. This one just shows a triangle fence coming off a boundary fence, where we've just put in one single post and fenced out to include this red box tree. And we realised that really adding to existing fences, although it was very convenient, and it's great if you run electric because it's easy to get power to those sites, generally results in pretty small sites. And we've had 0 success rate with getting shrubs planted in here because it's just too close to the drip line of that tree. So you can create large habitat patches by protecting clumps of trees, and this works really well. This is a small waterway running through the right side of the screen here. So these are probably our sites that we've had our best returns, where we've got blocks of shrubs out in the open, which we've been able to establish, and then we've protected clumps of really big old paddock trees. That one in the distance, that was about 9 metres around circumference on that river red gum. It was just beautiful, and it was, you know, it had so many hollows up through the canopy. So those larger sites are probably more successful. We've had a lot of creative approaches to fencing, and pretty much anything goes. I think every landholder I've dealt with has their own style for fencing, and there's really no right and wrong as long as it works for you and it's stock proof and it prevents stock getting access to those sites, then it's going to do the job. Good site preparation at these sites is really essential because of the impacts of competition for water. You know, anything that we can do that maximises water for those shrubs is going to help establishment. So ripping outside of the root zone of your trees can help get moisture down into the subsoil where the shrubs can access it, and good spraying to control grass so that that grass doesn't compete with moisture, and your shrubs get a chance to establish. So good site preparation does pay dividends in the long run. This is Brent's picture of fallen timber. Incorporating fallen timber is really beneficial. So you're providing homes for insects and lizards, and look, we've had anti-kinuses running through these sites at times as well. And so you start to get a little, a little ecosystem out in the middle of your paddock that's going to start sustaining and building over time. So everything that you can do to start to build that up from the ground is really important. We certainly found that we got our shrubs established better at larger sites, and we've really talked about that tonight. And incorporating water builds biodiversity. So this is a big old remnant yellow box up at Myree, and all those tree guards that you can see, they're just a big block of shrubs. And I think we've planted a scattering of trees through it, but they're nearly all shrubs. So close proximity to water means that your birds have got everything that they need in one place to provide a one-stop shop for them, really. Think carefully about the type of guards that best suit your site. If you have no predators, then a cheap and cheerful milk carton guard, they're about 50 cents for 2 bamboo stakes, and a little 2-litre milk carton guard do a great job. But if you've got browsing kangaroos, rabbits, hares, cockatoos, they all affect what sorts of guards we would choose at our sites. So a bigger, taller core flute guard means your shrubs get right up to the top before they can start to be browsed. And if they get nipped by the time they're at this height, which is about 60 centimetres, probably not going to be the cause the death of the shrub. The shrub's going to be robust enough to withstand a bit of munching, a bit of tip pruning. So guard choice can be a bit of a make or break. So that's the end. Thank you, everybody. I'm happy to take more questions. If everyone wants to unmute themselves, we can. Happy to field anything else that I can. See if I can get you all back up on my screen. No further questions?
Yeah, look, thanks, Sally, and thank you, Brent. That was great to hear about your story and see some of the work that you've done. And a beautiful, I mean, isn't that a lovely tree that you've got on the screen now, Sally? That's just a corker.
Yeah,
That's
this
lovely.
is another enormous one down at Glenrowan West. It was about 10.5 metres in circumference around the base. I just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, I think. It was.
Can you tell how old? I mean, how do we age the trees? How do we estimate the age of them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think early on, my rule of thumb and kind of everyone's accepted rule of thumb is 1 centimetre in diameter per year. But I think for our large trees, very quickly, they don't grow in girth, over time. So I think that probably tapers off towards the end. So the older they get, the less appropriate that is. I really don't know how you would tell it, and you don't want to cut it down to count the growth rings. So I would say 300 years plus for something of that size. It's just significant.
I could believe it.
Mm.
We've got one here at Biowatha. Some people came to look at a couple of years ago as part of a creek revegetation project that we did. And this expert, I can't think who he was, suggested this particular one we've got on the creek cliff was 450 to 600 years. It's a significant girth. It's 12 metres or something. Yeah. But it's ugly. It's broken and it limbs in all directions and so forth. But it struggles right on the top of a cliff. So I really am frightened that in the next 20 years it will fall into the creek. We've lost about 6 significant trees in the last 15 years or so. Yeah. And it is, it is a shame when we lose them. And I think, there's natural causes to that. And sometimes we've accelerated the rate at which we've lost our paddock trees.
And so every site is different, and so every tree has different threats that might be the key things that's driving it. So it's a bit of an assessment, very individual to look at what's happening and what you could do to fix it, I think.
So that's one that I don't think was on your list, erosion. And Craig, I agree. We've had some trees fall into the creek. One that we thought was going to go, years, soon after we bought the place, and it hung on for another 20 years, but it did in the end go. And there's little you can do to stop it if it's an issue of drainage and all the other things that contribute. So that's the importance of doing site assessments, Sally, and tailoring this, choosing the trees as Brent has done, and understanding what threats are facing and treating those threats, as well as understanding what your objectives are in terms of your own priorities and, how much grazing land you're able to give up.
And look, we've got it wrong on a number of occasions where we've spent money protecting trees, and then I've had a windstorm come through, and I had a beautiful longleaf box tree up at Myree, which to me looked fine and healthy, and then in a windstorm the whole thing split in the middle and it was just rotten right up through the centre, and we'd have never seen that, and it was about 6 months after we had fenced it and planted all around it. So it's become just very much a little island of shrubs out in the paddock. We've left all the fallen timber there, which will provide some habitat, but it was really disappointing. And we've had other trees where we've had clusters of red stringies up on hilltops get wiped over in big windstorms after we've done works to protect them. So yeah, we've not always succeeded, but we have learned a lot along the way about, different methods of protection and what works and what doesn't work for our area. So, yeah.
So are isolated trees more vulnerable to wind damage and lightning and other natural sort of disasters?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. From a wind point of view, they're much more exposed. They've got nothing around them to protect them. And we had at yesterday's webinar, we had Anthony Griffiths talking about some of his country over at Glenrowan West, and one of his hill slopes, he said, he's on a mudstone, which naturally attracts lightning. And he said he gets lightning strikes on that particular ridge on his property all the time. And so he frequently loses trees and loses branches on trees because of lightning strikes on those trees, because of the soil type that ridge is composed of. It seems to attract the lightning. And that's quite near to where Brent is too, who know the ridge I'm talking about. So, yeah, I mean, I think, I do think that they're exposed to the elements. And as we see more storm activity, they're going to be exposed to more storm activity as well.
So you probably are, it's wise to consider the value of a cluster of trees.
And if you're planting from scratch, certainly, and we'll cover this at the next workshops that we'll try and deliver at the end of September, I do sort of say to people, consider planting in clumps, not just one here, one there. So you might do 5 in a patch that might be spread, 15 metres between each of the centres. So that they get a bit of support over time as they grow up. And also over time, those canopies of those that you've planted will start to mesh together to form nice protected areas underneath. So I guess that's thinking about it purely from a shade point of view for stock. And if you had a biodiversity objective to your project, you might position them differently. And that's something else that we'll touch on at that workshop. Yeah.
Sally, I've heard them say that when you get increase the number of trees and things, you can change the microclimate in the area.
Yep.
What density, I guess, are we talking about where you can actually affect climate?
Oh, it's a great question, Russell, and I don't have a scientific answer for that. I mean, there's all this work being done around land rehydration at the moment, where we just talk about, capturing water and storing it in the landscape and how that can affect your, not just your soil moisture, but the rate of evaporation and also your ability to attract greater rain on those areas. So there's a lot being done in that space around microclimates, but I haven't read anything specifically around trees, but I would think that, yeah, you've definitely got the ability. And particularly if you like Brent, when I showed you all of the corridors intersecting his property, I would say there's quite distinct microclimates in little parts on Brent's property. And he, as a sheep farmer, would have very definite paddocks for, you know, young lambs at certain times of the year where he knows that they're warmer, there's less wind. So I don't know if it's paddock trees on their own, but I certainly think in combination with shelter belts, you can definitely create that. Yeah.
When you
just on that point, Sally, Pauline's very much on the weather forecast and deciding which paddock those stocks should be in when the conditions are bad. And
Yep.
we are rotating across 18 paddocks with at the moment 2 small mobs. And yes, it's a matter of where the shade is and where the wind protection is. And for some reasons, for some of that reason, we are looking at perhaps a bit more planting to give more wind protection in a couple of paddocks that are a bit light on.
Yeah, yep. And that's good that you've got a farm plan that's set up where you know what you've got in each paddock and how you can use it to maximise your productivity, I guess. Yeah. Keep going, Russell. What else would you?
I was just going to ask, I guess I'm thinking ahead to September and the replanting workshop that you're going to run then. But I was just wondering whether you encourage people to plant the same eucalypts that are common or are native to that area, or whether you would encourage them to plant perhaps a faster growing or a more climate resistant tree or what have you in your area in the future.
And it's an excellent question, because we had a question yesterday around should we be encouraging the planting of European trees, for example, as paddock trees. And I think that as a whole, I'd probably say that I still believe that eucalypts are our most resilient type of tree for our landscape, for where we are. But there are obviously some that are more susceptible to impacts of stock than other types. So if you've got a tree with really stringy bark, cattle are just going to love to always come and peel the bark off that for roughage. So if you're planning on planting paddock trees and you don't want to keep them guarded all the time, then I'd be looking at saying, you know, plant something with a smooth bark that we know is tolerant of stock. So things like your Blakeleys or your river red gum would be a straight out choice for that. Our experience over in Greta is that our box trees have been more susceptible to impacts of the high nutrient loads at the base. So river red gum tend to be a bit more tolerant of that. And we've found our red box trees, and to a lesser extent the yellow box, have really suffered from excessive amounts of stock camping at the base. So that might define what you plant. I think you'd want to be looking to species that you know work in your local area. But one way of increasing their ability to cope in a warming climate is potentially to source those trees and grow them from a nursery that's perhaps further north. So if you consider that the climate analogues tell us that by 2050 our climate could be like Dubbo, then yellow box still grows in Dubbo, but it would be of a different provenance to what we grow down here. So maybe a way around it is that we collect seed from places further north that are hotter and drier, that are also the same species. So yellow box from up around Deniliquin or Holbrook or further north, and they're the ones that we use as our replacements. That's probably where our state government is suggesting, and they're suggesting for things like shelter belt plantings that we use 60% locally provenant seed, 20% of seed from climates hotter and drier, and 20% of seed from cooler, wetter, just to hedge our bets and to build some genetic resilience into our plantings in the landscape. So I don't have a straightforward answer. There's a few different things to think about in that, but it is a definite consideration and something we do need to look at, I think. Yeah. I'm conscious that we've been going for an hour and a half. So we might wrap up. Does anyone have a last question before we close the session?
Just a comment for Russell there. We happen to have on our property 2 oak trees that were there before we arrived, along with the remnants of some poplars that have really struggled. Now, the 2 oak trees, I wouldn't consider planting them, but they are quite nice in the middle of summer. But they're not really food value for any native birds. And that's where I tend to be putting a bias towards native trees, Australian trees. So just a thought there. It's nice to have an oak tree or two, but not too many of them.
Yeah. Look, I like the idea that the natives for the wildlife and the birds as well. On my property, we have dozens and dozens of elm trees that were planted back in the 1860s and 70s. And these trees are, over 160 years age, they're huge. And they're fabulous in summertime for stock shelter.
Yeah.
They don't do much in winter.
Yeah. And I think...
but they're great in summer.
Yeah,
but
and
yes,
I think
they take ages to grow too.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. If it's summer shade that you need, then an exotic tree is going to do a brilliant job of that, because you've got nearly 100% foliage cover, whereas a eucalypt will provide you with dappled shade, and it's usually about 50% cover. On the flip side to that, as you've identified, you get no warmth out of them in winter because there's not a leaf on them, so there's no protection from frost, and so one of the concerns with climate change is that we're going to get an increase in these late sort of spring frosts where the general weather has warmed up and your stock is starting to get used to the nice warm sunny days. And then if we get hit with a -2 now, that really shocks them more than if it happens in the depths of winter, because their body systems have started to regulate to that. So those exotic trees aren't in leaf by that time. You don't have that ability to get that shelter from it. So I guess it's a balance, and exotic trees around yards and on laneways are an excellent choice, because they give you full shade in summer for you and your stock if you're working in the yard. And then in winter, you get full sun, which keeps you all warm when you're working in the yard. So it's different applications for different places, and I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve at that particular site. So yeah, lots of things to think about. It's good comments from everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Sally. That's been a really good presentation, and certainly given us a lot to think about. And thanks everyone for participating. That's been good.
I'm sorry we've gone a little bit over. It's really hard when there's so much to talk about with these trees, and always so many good comments. So thank you all for staying online, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. And I'm certainly happy to answer any specific questions that you might have down the track. You would have received my email address with my phone number on that email today, so feel free to give me a call if there's anything else that we haven't answered tonight that you'd like to ask. That would be great.
Thank you very much, Sally.
Yes, thank you, Sally.
Everybody.
Thanks, Sally.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.
Bye.